The colony of Arcadia had always been the galaxy's forgotten experiment. Hidden in the distant corners of the Helios system, it was a place where humans had come to rebuild, to reclaim their place in a universe that had long since outgrown their fragile planet. At first, it had seemed like nothing more than a pit stop for the desperate, a temporary sanctuary for those fleeing the chaos of Earth's collapse. They were the ones left behind, abandoned by the core worlds and struggling to survive on a hostile, barren rock. Life on Arcadia was a constant battle. The planet was unforgiving, an arid wasteland of jagged cliffs and endless dust storms. Resources were scarce. The colony's power grid barely functioned, and the air, though breathable, was thin. The settlers had no illusion about the challenges they faced. They were weak, at least in comparison to the towering empires that ruled the galaxy. Yet there was something in the way they persevered, a quiet but unyielding determination. They had no choice but to fight, and fight they did. Governor Alara Dorn had been thrust into leadership when the colony's former ruler mysteriously vanished, leaving behind only whispers of betrayal and half-forgotten promises. She was young. For a leader, her age often used against her by the more seasoned factions in the system, but her mind was sharp. She understood what it meant to survive, to carve something out of nothing. She'd seen the looks on the faces of the settlers, the wariness in their eyes whenever the larger, more powerful ships passed by. Some might call it fear, but Alara saw something more. Defiance. The colony had never been a strategic asset. No rich resources, no important location, just a rock in the middle of nowhere. It was a place the galaxy had forgotten. The rest of the universe had long ago dismissed Arcadia as irrelevant, its inhabitants as little more than a blip in the galaxy's vast expanse. But now, things were about to change. It started with the discovery of the crystal. No one knew how. It had come to be buried in the caverns beneath the colony, but when the miners unearthed it, it was like a spark in the dark, a single fragment of unknown material, its surface gleaming with an unnatural, iridescent glow. At first it seemed like another curiosity, a rare mineral perhaps. But as they analyzed its properties, the truth became undeniable. The crystal was unlike anything humanity had encountered. It had the potential to power entire fleets, to unlock new technologies far beyond current capabilities. It was the kind of resource that could rewrite the rules of the galaxy. The news spread fast, and it didn't take long for the first ships to arrive. At first, they were small, just a few curious traders and resource scouts. But as the rumors grew, so did the interest. And then the Empire ships appeared, huge, imposing vessels that seemed to blot out the sun as they entered Arcadia's orbit. They were the type of ships built by the ancient, powerful alien factions that controlled the galactic trade routes, the kind of ships that demanded respect and silence. Alara stood on the observation deck, watching the ships approach with a sense of growing unease. She had known this day would come, the day when someone would realize what the colony had discovered. She had prepared for it, but no amount of preparation could prepare her for the sheer magnitude of what was unfolding. Her hands tightened around the railing, knuckles whitening as the shadow of the alien fleet loomed larger. The first transmission came through. Arcadia, submit to the authority of the Galactic Union. Your possession of the crystalline element is in violation of galactic law. Stand down, or face immediate consequences. Alara's heart sank as she listened to the message. The Galactic Union, an ancient and powerful coalition of alien species who governed much of the known galaxy, was known for its ruthlessness. Their ships had raised colonies for far less, and their presence alone carried the weight of decades of conquest and diplomacy. But Arcadia was no ordinary colony. Alara knew that despite their small numbers and meager resources, they had something no one else did: their ingenuity. Humanity's greatest weapon wasn't their strength. It was their ability to adapt, to survive, to evolve in the face of impossible odds. If the Galactic Union thought they could simply waltz in and take the crystal, they were sorely mistaken. The message cut off abruptly, replaced by the unmistakable hum of energy shields as the first alien ship moved into position above Arcadia. It was time to act. Alara turned away from the observation window and strode toward the war room. Her mind raced, but she couldn't afford to show weakness. Every eye in the room turned toward her as she entered. The assembled council members, a mix of military leaders, scientists, and traders, waited in silence. "We have no choice," Alara said, her voice steady, though she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. "We can't let them take this. If we surrender the crystal, we're nothing more than a footnote in the galaxy's history. We fight, or we die." One of the senior officers, Captain Jarek, stepped forward. His face was grim, and there was an unmistakable air of resignation about him. "Governor, you're asking us to face the Galactic Union. They'll wipe us out in a matter of hours. We can't fight them with what we have." "We don't have to fight them with force," Alara countered. "We fight them with what they least expect. We fight them with the one thing they can't comprehend: humanity's creativity, our will to survive." The room was silent for a moment as everyone absorbed her words. It wasn't the first time. They had been underestimated. And if there was one thing Arcadia had learned, it was that when humanity was backed into a corner, they became something entirely different, something capable of unimaginable feats. It wasn't just about the crystal anymore. It was about showing the galaxy what humanity was truly capable of. Alara turned to the holographic map of the system. A plan began to form in her mind, one that would require every ounce of their resolve, every resource at their disposal. It was risky, dangerous, but it was their only chance. "We may be weak by their standards," Alara said, her eyes burning with conviction. "But we're about to show them just how dangerous we can be." The vast emptiness of space stretched infinitely beyond Arcadia's orbit, a black sea dotted with distant stars. But for all its isolation, the colony was no longer alone. The first enemy ship had arrived, massive, glimmering like a monolithic shard of obsidian, casting a long shadow over Arcadia's pale surface. It was the flagship of the Galactic Union, a vessel as old as the first interstellar empires, and its arrival marked the beginning of something much larger than any of them had anticipated. Alara stood at the command center, her face illuminated by the glow of the communications panel. She could feel the weight of every eye in the room as the senior council members watched her, waiting for direction. There was no hiding the tension in the air, the pulse of fear that ran through the walls of the colony like a growing storm. Her mind raced, but she fought to keep her composure. "Governor, they're demanding a response." Captain Jarek's voice was tight with unease, but he knew better than to question her decisions aloud. His eyes flicked between the comm screen and the holographic map that flickered above the table, showing the position of the Union ship in relation to their meager defenses. Ilara's hand tightened into a fist, her nails digging into her palm as she stared at the blinking signal. This was it. The moment they'd all feared. She had never expected this kind of confrontation to come so soon, but she knew better than anyone. The moment the crystal had been discovered, they'd painted a target on their backs. "We need to make contact," she said, her voice cold, the decision clear. "Put it through." The bridge fell silent as the transmission opened, and a distorted image of the alien representative flickered on the screen. It was an Andraxian, a tall insectoid species with a sleek, segmented carapace that shimmered faintly in the light of its ship's engine core. Its multifaceted eyes blinked slowly, as if it were sizing them up, determining how much of a threat they might pose. The alien's voice crackled through the speakers, low and menacing. "Governor Alara Dorn, you have one opportunity to surrender Arcadia and its resources to the Galactic Union. Your possession of the crystalline element is illegal. Any resistance will be met with the full force of the Union's military." Ilara's pulse quickened, but she refused to let it show. This was not a request, it was a threat, plain and simple, and the Union was not known for mercy. If they were allowed to take the crystal without resistance, Arcadia would be erased from the galaxy's memory, and humanity would remain a forgotten relic of a once great species. "We will not surrender," she replied, her voice unwavering. "Arcadia stands. The crystal belongs to us, and we won't let you take it." The alien's eyes narrowed, its expression unreadable. You misunderstand, human. This is not a negotiation. You will submit to our authority, or you will suffer the consequences. Before Ilara could respond, the transmission abruptly cut off. The room seemed to freeze, the weight of the alien's words hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Captain Jarek's voice was laced with apprehension. "Governor, if they attack—" "I know," she interrupted, her mind already working through the possibilities. "We can't stand against them in open combat. We need to think smarter." But even as she said it, a heavy dread settled in her stomach. They didn't have the firepower to challenge a fleet as advanced as the Union's. Their weapons were outdated, barely sufficient for defending against pirate raids. Arcadia's only real hope lay in their resourcefulness, their ability to adapt under pressure. And that crystal, the one thing the Union had so casually dismissed as unimportant, was now their only leverage. A sharp alarm cut through the room, signaling a new transmission. This time, it was not a demand from the Union. It was a threat. The bridge shook slightly as the first blast from the Union ship hit Arcadia's atmosphere. The impact sent tremors through the walls, rattling the colony's fragile infrastructure. It wasn't a full-scale attack, just a warning shot, but it was enough to send the Council into a frenzy. "They're already firing," Jarek said, his voice strained. "Status report," Ilara demanded. A technician scrambled to pull up the data. "Shields are holding at 50%. The impact didn't breach the surface, but the atmospheric pressure is fluctuating." "Activate emergency protocols," Ilara barked. "Seal the lower levels, initiate the blast shields in Sector 9 and divert all power to the defense grid. We'll need to buy ourselves time." The urgency in her voice was palpable, but deep down, Ilara knew that time was something they didn't have. Every moment they delayed meant more damage to their already fragile colony. They were running out of options, and the Union's next strike would not be a warning. "I want every available ship in orbit ready for launch," she ordered. "We're not just defending Arcadia anymore. We're making a statement." In the control room, Jarek didn't hesitate. "Yes, Governor, but we need more than just ships. We need a plan to strike back." That was the problem. Ilara knew the Union wasn't just here for the crystal. They were here to show Arcadia their place in the galaxy, to remind them of their insignificance. And if they allowed the Union to take the crystal, it would be the end of Arcadia, and with it, humanity's last chance at survival. There had to be another way. But what? She stared at the map of Arcadia's orbit, her mind churning. They didn't have the firepower to defeat the Union head-on, but they did have one advantage: the crystal. The resource wasn't just a power source, it was unlike anything the Union had ever encountered. And it was Arcadia's trump card. They could use it, weaponize it, or even harness it in ways that the Union wouldn't expect. But there was a risk. They didn't understand the crystal's full potential. It could backfire, causing more harm than good. Ilara was acutely aware of this. But as the Union ship fired again, closer this time, she realized the colony had no other option but to gamble everything. "The crystal," Ilara murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "It's our only chance." Ilara's decision was made. The course of action was clear. They would fight, not with the strength of armies, but with the ingenuity and resolve that had always defined humanity. But as she gave the order to begin, preparing the crystal for activation, a strange feeling of unease gripped her. The consequences of their actions were still unknown. And the truth was, no one had any idea just how powerful the crystal could be. As the first full barrage of the Union's weapons shook Arcadia's surface, Ilara couldn't help but feel the terrifying weight of what was to come. They were about to test the limits of human ingenuity and survival, at any cost. The situation was slipping out of their hands, faster than Ilara had anticipated. The Union's flagship, a massive structure resembling a jagged shard of obsidian, hovered ominously above Arcadia. It wasn't just a ship. It was a harbinger of extinction. The first barrage had crippled their outer defenses, and the second wave of firepower rattled the entire colony. They had barely been able to fortify their key sectors in time Shields are down to 30%. Jarek's voice crackled over the comms, heavy with tension. We need more time to power the anti-grav fields. Another hit like that and… I know, Ilara interrupted, her mind racing. We can't keep taking those hits. We need to strike first. Her words hung in the air like a dare. But the reality was harsh. They were outgunned, outclassed, and outnumbered. The Union's ships were as old as the galaxy itself, ancient and battle-tested, and Arcadia, with its patchwork fleet of scavenged ships and experimental tech, stood no chance. Indirect confrontation. She paced in the war room, biting back the rising panic clawing at her insides. The crystal, that once small discovery buried beneath the colony's surface, was now their only hope. The problem was, they had no idea what it was capable of. The energy readings were off the charts, unpredictable, erratic, but undeniably powerful. Governor, the crystal's ready for activation, came the report from Dr. Elian, the head of their scientific division. His voice, usually calm and collected, betrayed his anxiety. But we don't know what will happen once we use it. If we release that kind of energy, there's no telling how it will react. Ilara didn't respond immediately. She knew the risks. The crystal was a wild card, a gamble that could end in disaster. But there was no other choice. Either they tried to harness it and risk everything, or they let the Union take it and lose everything. Do it, she said firmly. We don't have a choice. With that, the order was given. They had no time to debate. Arcadia's fleet, such as it was, had already begun positioning itself. A ragtag assembly of scavenger ships, hastily retrofitted with whatever technology they could, scrounged, took formation around the base. Their weapons were weak, their shields flimsy, but if they were going to stand any chance, they had to take the first swing. Ilara stood at the helm of the control room, her eyes glued to the main viewport. Through the thick steel, she could see the Union ships hanging in space like vultures circling a dying beast. The enemy's flagship had already deployed smaller ships, sleek warcraft designed for rapid assaults. They were closing in, preparing to make the first strike on Arcadia's central core. A bright flash of light exploded in the distance. The first Union ship fired its heavy weapons, and the blast radiated across Arcadia's surface like the punch of a cosmic god. The shields cracked under the strain and the ground below shook violently. The shields won't hold much longer, Jarek shouted, desperation seeping into his tone. They're going to breach. Ilara's pulse quickened, but her resolve remained ironclad. Focus on the crystal. Give me a window of opportunity. The orders rang out, and the entire control room descended into chaos. The technicians scrambled to access every system, to maximize the energy output to the maximum tolerable limit. They had to turn the crystal into a weapon, even if they had no idea what kind of weapon it would be. As the countdown clock reached 0, Ilara gripped the edge of the console, her breath shallow. Now! A hum resonated from deep within Arcadia's core. The crystal's energy surged, then unleashed. What happened next was like nothing anyone could have expected. At first, it was a blinding pulse of light. A beam shot from the planet's surface straight into space, striking the Union ship closest to them. The light wasn't just blinding, it was hot, intense. A spear of raw energy that cut through the void like a laser beam through fabric. It hit the enemy vessel dead center, sending it spiraling out of control. Then came the shockwave, a pulse of force that rippled through space, knocking back the Union ships like leaves caught in a windstorm. The smaller warships flung backward, tumbling as if the very fabric of reality had been torn asunder. The flagship, though larger and more resilient, trembled, its engines faltering under the strain of the unexpected surge. For a moment, the universe seemed to hold its breath. Did we? Jarek's voice trailed off as the enemy fleet seemed to hesitate, as if the strike had shaken them to their core. Ilara's heart pounded in her chest. It was working, but at what cost? The crystal had never shown signs of being able to produce this kind of destructive energy. They had unleashed something that might not just destroy their enemies but tear apart the very fabric of space-time itself. "We've got a window," Jarek shouted. "Now's our chance to strike. We can't let them regroup." Ilara nodded sharply, her voice low but determined. "Launch everything we've got. Full assault. We make them regret underestimating us." In the silence that followed, the ragtag fleet of Arcadia's ships sprang into motion. They weren't going to win this with sheer numbers or firepower. They would have to rely on something far more dangerous: surprise. The Union had underestimated them, assuming that their meager resources and ragged fleet made them easy prey. But humanity's strength lay in their desperation. They were not bound by the rules of galactic war. They had nothing left to lose. Arcadia's ships darted forward, closing the distance between them and the enemy. The first few shots they fired were weak, but they had a plan. They weren't aiming for the heavily shielded Union vessels. Instead, they targeted the auxiliary systems, the communication relays, the sensors, the engine ports. "We're disrupting their systems," one of the technicians reported. "The flagship's shields are fai. They can't see us." "Keep hitting them," Ilara ordered, her voice sharp. "Disrupt their ability to regroup. We hit them while they're scrambling." The tide was turning. The Union's advanced ships had never faced anything like this. The attack had broken their command structure. Their shields were down, their systems were failing. They were no longer the mighty conquerors of the galaxy, but a disorganized fleet struggling to maintain control. Then, as if on cue, the Union flagship fired a retaliatory shot. It was a precise strike, directly at Arcadia's heart. The blast slammed into the colony's core, and for a moment, Ilara thought it was over. The ground shook violently, and the lights flickered. But Arcadia held. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "We're still standing," Jarek said, breathless. The Union fleet was staggering now, its ships limping in space, unable to respond effectively. Arcadia's final push came as they launched the last of their fleet into the heart of the Union armada. The smaller ships engaged in guerrilla tactics, darting between Union vessels, attacking weak spots, while the flagship, Arcadia's largest ship, though still small by Union standards, prepared its final strike. Ilara watched as the crystal pulsed once again, this time focusing its energy on the heart of the enemy flagship. She could feel the immense pressure building in her chest as the power coursed through the colony. This was it, the moment when Arcadia would either survive or fall. "Now!" Ilara shouted. "Finish it!" The energy blast from the crystal surged, sending a wave of destruction that consumed the Union flagship. The last remnants of its shields disintegrated under the intense force, and the ship's engines imploded in a massive explosion, sending debris scattering across space. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then the communication channels came to life, the voices of the remaining Union officers crackling through the static. "We surrender. We were wrong. Please stop." Ilara exhaled slowly. The impossible had been achieved. Arcadia was still standing. They had won. But the victory, she knew, was far from complete. The galaxy had seen humanity's power. The question now was, what would they do with it? The Union's surrender was just the beginning. Arcadia had proven that humanity could not be so easily dismissed, but Ilara knew the price of that victory would be steep. The galaxy would not forget what they had done, nor would they forgive it. As Arcadia prepared for the uncertain future, ahead Ilara wondered whether their newfound strength would be their salvation or their doom. The battle had stretched far longer than Ilara had hoped, but the war was not over. The Union fleet had been crippled, its flagship reduced to debris, but the victory felt hollow. As the final remnants of the Galactic Union's forces limped away, scattered across the stars like broken pieces of a once proud empire, Ilara stood at the bridge, her gaze locked on the screen. A single Union ship remained. It had fled when the others were destroyed, managing to avoid the full brunt of Arcadia's counterstrike. Now, it was limping away, wounded, but not broken. The last hope of the Union's military might was still out there. "Governor," Jarek's voice was tight with suppressed anger. That ship won't just disappear, it's reporting its location. They're gathering reinforcements. We need to finish this. Ilara gripped the edge of the console, her heart pounding in her chest. They couldn't afford to let the Union regroup. They couldn't let Arcadia's victory become nothing more than a temporary reprieve. The Union would return, stronger, more prepared. The galaxy would not let humanity's defiance go unanswered. But as the final pieces of the Union fleet slipped into hyperspace, Ilara's eyes fell to the blinking readout showing the status of the crystal. The energy levels were still dangerously high. The raw power they had unleashed was enough to devastate an entire fleet, but it was also unpredictable, unstable. The more they used it, the more it seemed to respond in ways they couldn't understand. Dr. Elian's voice crackled over the comms. Governor, the crystal's feedback is growing increasingly erratic. If we continue to drain it, I know, Ilara said, cutting him off. Her mind was spinning, torn between the immediate threat of Union retaliation and the growing, unshakable fear of what the crystal could become if they pushed it too far. But we can't stop now. Not after everything. The decision weighed heavily on her, but it was clear. Arcadia needed to end this now. She couldn't let the Union come back for another strike. They had to use the crystal to their advantage, no matter the cost. Prepare for a final push, she ordered. Jarek didn't hesitate, his fingers flying across the controls. All ships are ready, Governor. We'll launch everything we've got. As the command was given, the distant hum of Arcadia's fleet powered up. The rattle of engines and the sudden surge of energy rippled through the colony's infrastructure. The ragtag fleet of ships, though small and primitive by Union standards, now had the full backing of Arcadia's weapons systems. The crystal's energy, wild, uncontrollable, yet incredibly powerful, was their last and only chance. But even as they prepared for their final assault, Ilara's thoughts remained with the crystal. It had become more than just a tool, more than a weapon. It was now a ticking time bomb. Its unpredictable power could destroy them all, just as easily as it had saved them. A report came through from one of the reconnaissance ships. We've located the Union ship. It's in the Tiburon Nebula, taking evasive action, but we're within firing range. Should we proceed with the strike? Ilara stood frozen for a moment. The nebula was an inhospitable region of space, filled with cosmic radiation, gravitational anomalies, and pockets of dark matter. It was a perfect hiding spot, if the Union ship knew what it was doing. But it also meant that Arcadia's fleet would be at a disadvantage. Any strike launched into the nebula would be risky, and the ship's chances of survival were minimal. Proceed, Ilara said, her voice firm, even as her mind raced. We can't let them escape. We launch everything. The engines roared to life as Arcadia's fleet moved into position. The Union ship, a battered but still dangerous vessel, flickered on the edge of the nebula. It was slowing down, as though anticipating Arcadia's next move. But Ilara knew that was part of their plan, to lure them in. It was a trap. The crystal's energy surged again, this time responding to the impending danger. It pulsed violently, its glow brightening as if it had a mind of its own, as though the very fabric of the universe was bending around it. I don't think we can control this much longer, Dr. Elian warned, his voice rising with panic. The crystal's readings are off the scale. If we push it too far, it could... It's too late for second thoughts, Ilara snapped, her eyes locked on the Union ship's position. We end this here. The Arcadian fleet closed in, their weapons primed. The Union ship, desperate, fired first. The beam of energy shot out, splintering the nebula's gas clouds, but it was weak. Too weak. The Arcadian ships were already in motion, evading and retaliating with swift precision. They struck the Union ship's engines, disabling its ability to maneuver. The battle had begun, but it wasn't just about firepower anymore. The Union was fighting for survival, and they would not go down easily. As Ilara's fleet moved in for the kill, a pulse of energy erupted from the crystal once more, but this time, it was unlike anything they'd experienced before. The shockwave tore through the nebula, sending ripples of energy that distorted the fabric of space itself. The Arcadian ships veered off course, struggling to maintain control as the energy wreaked havoc on their systems. Ilara gripped the console, her knuckles white. "What the hell is happening? Shut it down!" But the crystal was no longer responding. To their commands, it was beyond control. "We can't stop it." Dr. Elian's voice was filled with fear. "It's feeding off the battle. It's feeding off the conflict. We've opened a conduit to something bigger." The light from the crystal intensified, flashing like a supernova. And then, in the blink of an eye, it collapsed in on itself, forming a vortex in the center of the nebula. The fabric of reality itself seemed to twist, pulling everything into the swirling maelstrom. Arcadia's fleet, the Union ship, even the remnants of the nebula, all were drawn into the event horizon. Ilara's heart stopped as she saw their world shifting, crumbling. The vortex was no longer just a weapon. It was a doorway, an entry into something greater. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the light vanished. The battle stopped. Everything went silent. Ilara blinked, trying to understand what had just happened. The Union ship, once formidable, was now nothing but an empty shell, floating in the center of the nebula. Her fleet was scattered, crippled, or worse. The crystal's pulse had come to an end, but its impact was far beyond anything they could have predicted. They had won. But at what cost? The vortex had opened a path into something unknown, and humanity's victory had only begun to unravel. What lay on the other side was a question that could not be answered yet. The silence that followed the collapse of the crystal's energy was unlike anything Ilara had ever known. For a moment she thought she might have gone deaf, or perhaps they had all been consumed by the maelstrom that had erupted in the heart of the nebula. The hum of engines, the distant crackle of comms, the thrumming heartbeat of Arcadia's once bustling colony. All of it was gone. Nothing but emptiness. She felt the tremor in her chest, the weight of something monumental hanging in the air. The fleet was still there, but it had been altered. What faced a greater threat than any war? The unknown forces that the crystal had awakened, and the terrifying implications of what lay ahead. The question wasn't whether they would survive. It was whether they could control the force they had set loose. The stars outside the bridge were still, a cold and distant reminder of how much had changed in the wake of the battle. Arcadia's fleet had retreated to its home orbit, surrounded by its damaged ships and scattered survivors, now haunted by a quiet uncertainty. The Federation had been dealt a severe blow, but the true cost of their victory hadn't yet been fully realized. No one had prepared for the shift that had taken place, not just in the universe but within themselves. Ilara stood at the helm, her gaze fixed on the distant stars, the nebula now nothing but a shadow in the rear view of the galaxy. The echo of the crystal's explosion still reverberated in her mind, a violent tremor in the very fabric of space and time. She thought they had won. They had stopped the Union, but now something far darker loomed on the horizon. Ilara. Yarek's voice broke through her thoughts. "We've gathered the fleet. Everyone's accounted for, but it's not over, is it?" She turned, her eyes locking with his. She could see the worry, the unspoken fear in his eyes, the same fear that gnawed at her insides. They had all felt it. The anomaly, the signal that had begun to pulse out from the core of the nebula, expanding, growing stronger by the day. "No," she replied, her voice steady, but laced with a quiet resolve. "It's not over. We've only just begun to understand what we've unleashed." The last of the Union ships had vanished into the void, but there was no triumph in that. It felt like a pause before a storm. The signal, still growing, was now detectable by every ship in the fleet, echoing through their communications like a distant beckoning call. Something, or someone, was out there, responding to the energy they had unleashed. And whatever it wasn't human. Dr. Elian's latest report had been sobering. The energy readings from the anomaly were now reaching critical mass, and the patterns of the signal had taken on an alarming new quality. It wasn't just a cosmic phenomenon anymore. It was intelligent. It had purpose. And if there was one thing Alara knew, it was that humanity had never faced anything like this before. "We need to find it," she said, more to herself than anyone else. "Whatever it is, wherever it's coming from, we can't let it come to us on its own terms." Jarek nodded. "I'll gather the officers. We'll begin tracking the source, but Alara, whatever this is, it's beyond anything we've ever encountered. Are we ready for this?" Alara met his gaze. She could see the doubt, the fear, but also the spark of determination. They had fought, the Union. They had survived against impossible odds, but this was something else. This was unknown, and nothing about it felt like a fight they could win. But if there was one thing humanity had shown the galaxy, time and time again, it was that they didn't back down from challenges, no matter how insurmountable they seemed. "We have no choice," Alara said quietly, her voice a razor-sharp edge, in the quiet of the bridge. "We have to face it, we have to understand it, and we'll do it together. Whatever comes next, we'll handle it like we always have." She turned to face the holographic map of the galaxy that flickered on the wall, the signal's increasing intensity mapped out in a glowing thread. The path it traced was clear. It led straight into the heart of the unknown. "Set a course," Alara said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "We're going to find the source of this signal, and when we do, we'll be ready." The ship's engines hummed to life as they powered up for the final jump. Arcadia, their people, their entire future, was heading into the unknown, chasing the call of a power they couldn't understand. The signal pulsed again, louder now, more insistent. A new chapter had begun. The camera zoomed out from Arcadia's fleet, the stars twinkling in the distance as they moved toward the anomaly. But as the fleet entered hyperspace, there was a flicker in the fabric of space-time, a ripple in the cosmic fabric. In the far reaches of the galaxy, an unseen force watched, its gaze focused on Arcadia, on humanity's next step. And the signal continued pulsing in the silence, growing louder. It wasn't over, not by a long shot.